The Last of Us Part 2. A game that has come under fire for its off-the-wall direction, and a game that's been review bombed on Metacritic, a game whose cast and crew have been harassed on Twitter, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few death threats thrown in there, and a game that I've been left kinda scratching my head as to why this game turned out the way it did. This is not what I had in mind for the sequel to what's considered to be one of the best video games ever made, one of the most successful video games ever made, and the highest rated video game that came out last decade. And I'm talking the user score on Metacritic. This is not what I had in mind whatsoever. So, starting off with what's actually good here. As far as this game being a AAA production goes, this is some of the highest tier quality that you can find in the video game industry. And I'm not just talking about the graphics engine. I'm not just talking about the character animations or the facial animations. I'm not just talking about the weather effects. I'm talking about the complete package. Gameplay, graphics, animation, character interaction, foliage, weather effects, facial animations, the whole 9 yards. All of it is extreme top tier quality. Which is why it's a shame that, unfortunately, the main draw of Naughty Dog games and the main draw of The Last of Us as an IP is the story. Because, yeah, there have been some impressive refinements to the gameplay as far as the combat system goes, and the new enemy types on both the human side and the infected side. The crafting system has been improved as well. There's been some neat little additions, from new ammo types to being able to craft silencers and new types of bombs, and just a refinement with with certain weapons such as the bow and arrow. All of that's great, and the AI is actually pretty sophisticated in this game. The AI has been nitpicked in this game to be not very smart, which confuses me because you can really say that about any video game that's out there. Artificial intelligence in video games is never going to be on the same level as human intelligence. Human intelligence is always going to outsmart artificial intelligence, and that's just fact. Artificial intelligence is just there to give the illusion of challenge. But as a human being, you're always going to be able to outsmart the AI. So I'm not really understanding where those complaints were coming from with this game, because it's stupid and it really doesn't make any sense. If you're going to say that the AI is stupid in this game, you can make that argument for pretty much any other video game that's out there. And I've seen some really poorly designed AI from other video games, and The Last of Us just doesn't fall in the same category by comparison. So I really don't have much of anything to complain about in regards to the gameplay. There are certain things that I think should have been handled better as far as the gameplay goes. For example, I simply don't like the addition of dogs in this game. The dogs are extremely annoying, and there's no way to really mask your scent, which is the big problem with them. The dogs are able to track your scent no matter where you go, and you can't just simply ignore them or throw them off your tail. And I think that's a big problem from a gameplay perspective. And I also don't like the stalkers on the infected side. They're extremely annoying. It's pretty much impossible to use stealth against them, which is the big problem with them. Yeah, I don't really like those enemy types. And I think the dodge mechanic is a bit on the QTE side, without it actually being an in-your-face contextual action in the middle of combat. And I think that particular mechanic could have been handled better, but it could have also been handled a lot worse. So again, these are small things. They're not really big issues. So I really don't have much of anything to say that's bad about the actual gameplay of The Last of Us Part 2. But there are two major issues with this game. The first is the length, and the second is the story. Just real quick, commenting briefly on the length. So the original The Last of Us is 15 hours long. It's around 15 hours, no matter which difficulty you're playing on. If you're going for collectibles, you might be able to drag it out a bit longer, but for the most part, it's around 15 hours long. And it's the perfect length for a tightly scripted narrative game such as this. It doesn't overstay its welcome, nor is it so short to the point where it doesn't feel like it's worth the $60 price tag for a AAA budget. The Last of Us, it just had the perfect length for a narrative style game that's tightly scripted and very narrowly focused. The Last of Us Part 2, on the other hand, does not have a good length. The game is too long, quite simply. The reason that's an issue is because after a while, no matter which video game you're playing, no matter which genre of game you're playing, after a while, the gameplay loop starts to get old and repetitive. And the only way that game developers can prevent that from happening, the longer a game goes on, is to introduce new things, introduce new gameplay mechanics, introduce new enemy types, and it also helps if you have a well-written story, which the original game did. This sequel does not, and I'm going to talk about the story. The story is the main thing that I'm going to discuss in this video, but yeah, the game is divided into, I'd say, 3 different acts. Act 1 would be Ellie's act. Act 2 would be Abby's act, and then Act 3 would be like the epilogue. The problem really comes more from the second and the third acts than the first one. Abby's sections in this game are too long. They really don't add much of anything to the plot. In fact, a lot of what happens with Abby as far as the story goes feels like it was just forced into the game to artificially extend the length. And that's a huge problem. And then the epilogue is too long and could have been shortened exponentially. Could have and should have, but didn't. So that's also a big problem. And essentially from the first game, as far as the environments go, the trek that Joel and Ellie make across a post-apocalyptic America saw a wide variety of diverse locations. Whereas The Last of Us Part 2 hampers itself by being contained to essentially one location throughout the vast majority of the game until pretty much the ending, and that's Seattle, Washington. Most of the game takes place over the course of 3 days, and so basically you start off in Jackson, which is the settlement that Joel and Ellie take refuge in, and that's where they're able to live normal lives between the 5-year gap from the last game to this one. You start off in Jackson, and then you go to Seattle for pretty much the rest of Act 1, the entirety of Act 2. And then in Act 3, you go to some farm in the middle of nowhere. And then the game shifts to Santa Barbara, California. And then you go back to the farm in the middle of nowhere, and that's the end of the game. So there's not a whole lot of diverse locations in the game compared to the first game. But there is enough variety there to where it doesn't become boring. I was never bored playing this game, but I was frustrated with a number of different things that they did in regards to the story. And the story is the biggest draw with this game. I've seen comments online of people trying to defend the story. I even saw one comment that asked the question, well, this is a video game. I'm here for the gameplay. Who cares about the story? If you want a story, go watch a television show, go watch a movie. And it's like, that's just fucking ignorance at best. That's pure fanboyism at best. The reason The Last of Us, the first game, the reason why that game was so successful is because of its story. Yeah, there were other good things to it, such as the gameplay, the fantastic multiplayer mode, the crafting system, the stealth system, the enemy NPC design. All of that was great, but what made the game work and why people love the original game is because of the narrative. And the reason the narrative worked is because of Joel and Ellie. Joel and Ellie are two of some of the best written video game characters of all time. And the reason their relationship works is because they play off of each other. And a lot of that has to do with Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker's performance. But I also would say that more so the reason that works is because of the writing. And we get scenes of Joel and Ellie together in these flashback sequences here and there throughout the game, but they're too few, far and in between. There's not enough of them in the game. And when you do get to those sequences, they're some of the strongest parts of the entire game. And it just makes you angry because it's like you wonder what could have been had they decided to just make this game another journey with Joel and Ellie, which is what they should have done, but that wasn't what Neil Druckmann was going for. What Neil Druckmann decided to do with this game's story is he wanted a game where he wanted players to feel the need to exact justice. And that's really what led to the creation of this game's story, which is a simple-minded revenge tale. And it's not a very good one. To summarize, The Last of Us Part 2 takes place 5 years after the first game. As I stated earlier, Joel and Ellie have taken refuge and has found peace in this settlement known as Jackson. And their peace doesn't last because there is a looming threat over the horizon. There is a small group of survivors from a faction known as WLF, also known as the Washington Liberation Front. In this small band of survivors, there is a new character named Abby. And it is Abby's goal to hunt down Joel and kill him because, just randomly, it just so happens that Joel, who saved Ellie's life at the end of the first game, killed one of the surgeons who was operating on her, and that surgeon just so happened to be the father of this Abby character. As if that wasn't contrived enough, Joel is killed off within the first 2 hours of this game. He does absolutely nothing important, and he is treated as an afterthought, as not even a side character. Joel isn't even a side character in this game. He's just an afterthought. So obviously the dull-minded decision to just kill him off without him having done anything important when he was one of the main characters from the first game and the only playable character throughout the majority of the first game, that was not a good decision. There's no way to defend that. That's just stupidity on the behalf of Neil Druckmann and co-writer Haley Gross. So after Joel dies, Ellie is obviously feeling very upset over his demise, and she sets out on a quest to find those responsible, to hunt them down, and to kill everyone who was involved in Joel's death. But the main person that she's looking for is Abby, who killed Joel in front of Ellie. So that's what's going on with Ellie in this game. Then it switches to Abby at around the midway point of this game. And for the last 10 to 12 or so hours, you play as Abby. And Abby's story is completely different from Ellie's story, almost to the point where it almost feels like it's another game entirely. Essentially, Abby finds herself in a bind later in her portion of the story, where she's almost killed by members of a tribe, this group known as the Seraphites, which are these religious zealots. Nicknamed Scars by the WLF, the Seraphites and the Scars are in this heated war. Why they're in a war and why they're constantly in conflict with each other, that's not really explained, but it doesn't really matter because it doesn't have really anything to do with the overall arching story. But anyway, it's fucking stupid either way. So just before some Scars, or Seraphites, whatever you want to call them, just before they kill Abby, these two Asian siblings who belong to the Scars save Abby's life, and they all become allies. And soon you start to see Abby reject the ideals of the WLF, and she ends up in a more gray area. Now, she doesn't know at first that Ellie is hunting her down, She doesn't find that out until later. Eventually, this leads to these two characters having a face-off, a showdown in which Abby almost kills Ellie, but decides to spare her life, leaving her with a warning that she doesn't ever want to see Ellie again. Then the game shifts into the third act, which is this epilogue. Ellie and this new character, one of the side characters, Dina, her lesbian girlfriend, they find this farm in the middle of pretty much nowhere and have built a safe haven, basically, with a fenced-off perimeter in which they are raising Dina's child. And the child belongs to her and this other character, this other side character, Jesse, who was killed off earlier in the game just before the start of the epilogue by Abby. And so Ellie and Dina are raising this child, and it's at this point that it seems that the game's going to end until it's revealed that Ellie is still haunted by Joel's death, and she feels that she hasn't accomplished her goal in avenging him. After an encouraging visit from Joel's brother Tommy, who was in the first game, Ellie decides to leave and hunt down Abby, whom Tommy has tracked down to Santa Barbara, California. And just before Ellie leaves to find Abby again, Dina warns her that if she leaves, she will not be there when Ellie comes back, if she comes back at all. Ellie ignores this and decides to leave anyway, and this leads into the last hour and a half or so of this game, and what's easily the weakest section of the entire game, full of poor level design and an overabundance of annoying enemy NPCs. And after fighting your way through waves and waves of enemies, Ellie finally discovers Abby again, who has been kidnapped along with the Asian character Lev, has been tortured and malnourished to the point where Abby has lost the vast majority of her muscle mass. And instead of killing Abby right then and there and just ending the game right there, Ellie decides to cut Abby down. She follows her to a beach where Abby puts Lev inside a boat, and then the two have a face-off because Ellie just won't leave well enough alone. The two have a face-off, a showdown, where Ellie gets the upper hand and pins Abby down under the water on this beach. And she's choking her out and, has her pinned in place. And finally, as the player, you think that Ellie is going to succeed and you want her to succeed to get vengeance for Joel. But just to force a twist into the ending, Neil Druckmann decided that Ellie, at the last moment, can't bring herself to kill Abby, and she releases her and lets her leave on the boat with Lev away from the beach for good. And that essentially means that Ellie didn't get vengeance for Joel, and Joel just pretty much died in vain for nothing. And if that wasn't bad enough, Ellie returns back to the farm where she and Dina made a life for themselves, and discovers that Dina has taken her child and much of the belongings in the house and has left her. So Ellie at this point has lost not only Joel, she's lost 2 fingers in the scuffle with Abby on the beach, so she can't play guitar anymore, and she's lost her lesbian girlfriend. So essentially what you have is this bleak ending where Ellie is literally left with nothing. She has really no purpose at this point. The revenge tale just goes nowhere because she doesn't get revenge on Abby. She decides to let Abby go. And the whole point of this ending is to force a theme that revenge is bad and nothing good can come of the parties involved. And that's it. The credits roll, and if you have any common sense, you will realize that this is actually one of the worst sequels in the history of video games. Maybe even the worst, depending on how you look at it. This story is complete bullshit. It does not work at all. And one of the main reasons is because, number one, Naughty Dog tries to force these different political agendas into the game. They have forced gender diversity where a lot of the enemy NPCs and a lot of the characters that you encounter in the game are women. And the only two playable characters in this game are women. That's because Anita Sarkeesian, her feminist views have invaded Naughty Dog's studio. And that's a big problem within of itself. And if you don't believe me, there's a video on the internet that you can find where Neil Druckmann presents Anita Sarkeesian with an award at one of these game developers award ceremonies. And that was only a few years ago, I believe back in 2014. And then you have a problem of a forced LGBTQ agenda in which it was revealed in the Left Behind DLC from the first game that Ellie was gay or that she was potentially bisexual, but it was such a small thing that it was pretty much an afterthought. And you would only know that if you play the DLC from the first game, whereas in this game, her sexuality is emphasized, and they have a sex scene, kinda, or the build up to a sex scene between her and the Dina character, but they don't actually go through with actually showing you two women having sex in the video game. And so that's actually worse than having the agenda, is not having the balls to actually show what you're preaching. And so, yeah, that pissed me off. Because quite frankly, I'm getting sick and tired of having the homosexual agenda shoved down my throat. I don't give a shit what anyone does in their free time, but I shouldn't be subjected to the homosexual lifestyle and have their views be forced on me when I don't agree with their views whatsoever, when I want to do something as simple as watching a movie or a television show or playing a video game. And this is a reason why I'm actually glad that people have spoken out against this game, because I do believe that Naughty Dog fans are smarter than the average gamer. And real simple, we don't want to see this kind of trash in the video game industry. There's no place for this sort of thing in entertainment. If you're part of the LGBTQ community, the entertainment industry is not the place for you to have your voices heard. It's not the right place, and it's never the right time. You want equality as a bisexual or as a trans or as a homosexual or whatever the case, become a political activist and actually do things that benefit your community. These game developers have a responsibility, and one of them is not to preach to a small minority of people. And so, yeah, that royally pissed me off. But what truly is the problem with the story to The Last of Us Part 2 is the fact that the game tries to subvert your expectations, and basically it succeeds, but it succeeds at the cost of its audience because it disrespects the characters from the first game. Both Joel and Tommy are just afterthoughts in this game. There's really no point for them to be in this game. And Joel could have easily been replaced with any of these other characters or whatever, any of these newer characters that were created specifically for this sequel. And the story would not have made any difference. It would not have changed. That's how unimportant Joel is in this game, and that's a problem. And Ellie just simply isn't as likable in her older counterpart compared to her younger self. So when you add all the flaws together, from the game's unusually long length to the forced political agendas and different statements on gender and sexuality in this game that don't need to be, that have absolutely nothing to do with the story, to the sections involving Abby in the game, which feels entirely disconnected from the overall arching story, to the terrible ending that goes nowhere, that makes the entire thing essentially pointless. And then you add these things on top of the fact that Sony and Naughty Dog were DMCA striking YouTube channels, and Sony disabling comments on YouTube videos that were related to this game to prevent anyone from posting spoilers, to Naughty Dog banning the use of replies to their post on Twitter prior to release. And you have one of the most poorly managed, highly controversial, and not in a good way, and disappointing sequels of all time. And you have the most disappointing game that has come out this year so far. And even though the game has sold 4 million copies and has become the fastest selling PlayStation 4 exclusive on the console, beating out the likes of Insomniac's Spider-Man and Sony Santa Monica's God of War, the undeserved perfect scores on Metacritic from your major video game publications and your major critics that are out there provides another example, another perfect picture that there is something extremely wrong with the video game industry and how video games are actually perceived by those who actually work in the industry versus normal consumers who just buy and play these things for entertainment, which is what they're for. So basically, in a nutshell, The Last of Us, if you're playing The Last of Us Part 2 purely just for the gameplay, which if you're doing something like that, you're in the extreme minority, because the story and the characters, the narrative as a whole is the main draw. You'll probably enjoy the game just on a gameplay level. If you're playing this game for the story and the characters, and you were looking forward to seeing the next chapter in Joel and Ellie's story, this is not worth your time. This is not worth anyone's time. The motherfuckers who have gone on the internet and have tried to defend this game, saying that the story is great and that the game's a masterpiece, it's like, fuck you. Because those people are the kinds of sheep that will accept anything that's put in front of them. And coming from someone who spent money on the collector's edition for this game, and I have no regrets spending money on the collector's edition because I personally like the statue or whatever of Ellie playing the guitar. It's a nice statue. When the statue of the collector's edition is better than the actual game itself, that's how you know that they fucked up. So yeah, unfortunately, this was my second most anticipated game this year, behind Cyberpunk 2077. And it's sad to see that it pretty much failed on every level in regards to the narrative. And that means the game as a whole is just a disappointment, because the narrative, once again, is the main draw of this game. And they completely just messed it up. It's to the point where I'm not going to support Naughty Dog anymore until there's a major restructuring internally for that company. As long as Neil Druckmann is the creative voice in that company, I'm not going to waste my time supporting Naughty Dog as a studio. I grew up with Naughty Dog. I've been a Naughty Dog fan since their Jak and Daxter days, and this is the first game that I've played of theirs that I don't like. And I was defending this game before it came out by saying, you know what, just despite the fact that the leaks turned out to be shit, yeah, it doesn't sound like the game's really going to be that great narratively. I was saying, you know what, because of the kind of game that it is, you got to play the game first and, play it from start to finish. Then, if you play it from start to finish and it's still shit, then speak, then voice your opinion. Yeah, that's what I did, and it sucks. It's not a good game, by fact. So, that's a shame. Hopefully, I'll forget about this game by the time Ghost of Tsushima comes out later next month. And if I have anything else that I want to add before I close this retrospective, I will say this about there being games in the industry that are first of all sequels that have introduced secondary playable characters that actually added to the narrative instead of taking away from what made the predecessor good. A perfect example of a sequel that introduces a secondary playable character, but simultaneously doesn't disrespect the characters from the original game that made the original game a success, is Halo 2. Halo 2 is the perfect example of a game that introduces a secondary playable character. The original characters that made the first game great are still there. They're not just haphazardly killed off, or they have their personalities changed to the point where they're unrecognizable. The secondary playable character that's introduced in Halo 2 is the Arbiter, which is an elite character that represents the covenant of all these different alien races. And the Arbiter soon comes to reject the ideals of the prophets that run the covenant. And he turns against the covenant and starts to fight on the side of humanity. And, this is another reason why Halo has some of the best storytelling in video game history in the entire medium. And Master Chief and Cortana aren't forgotten in that game. They are still a huge part of what made the first game great for the sequel. Now, later in Halo's history, they do make a very similar mistake to what The Last of Us Part 2 makes with Halo 5, which was just absolute trash. But they didn't fuck up to this degree with what Neil Druckmann and Haley Gross did with the story to this game. And so for anyone who's saying this game's a masterpiece, it's not. There are games out there that do things very similarly to what The Last of Us Part 2 does with its narrative, and does it much better than this game does it. So, like I said, it's a huge wasted opportunity what they did with this game. Yeah, Naughty Dog no longer is in my good graces after this. Neil Druckmann has to go. He has to go, plain and simple.